So, what's your professional opinion? Smells fucking disgusting. That right there was the opening lines to the story that I submitted to the Parsec short story writing contest. Actually, I think I edited the second piece of dialogue a little bit from that, but that's essentially what I started with. And when I started writing that story, that was all I had. That was the only thing I knew about that story when I started coming up with that idea. That one character was going to ask the other, what's your professional opinion? The other was going to answer, smells fucking disgusting. And from there, the idea grew and grew through this whole, I don't even know if it's really official step-by-step enough for me to call it a process, but it grew through the method of thinking that I use to come up with different ideas for different stories to write. And I'm going to share that process with you today so that you can start writing things that hopefully don't suck as much as what I said in my video about writing something terrible. You know, in that video I told you, you don't have to have a good idea to write. And that's true, you don't. You can write with a bad idea, and the practice is still valuable. But today, this video is for those who want to write something that's actually good. Something they might publish. Something that they might enter into a contest, put up for review, send to a publication, whatever. Something that they actually want to have a good idea coming into. That is what I'm going to teach you to create. The first step to coming up with a good idea for a story is to recognize that you don't have to start with a whole idea. You can start with just 1% of an idea. Those 2 lines was the only thing I had for that story when I began. And then I thought on that, and it became more of an idea. The percentage grew as I asked myself questions, which we'll get into in a little bit, about what I knew about the story, what I knew about the characters, and it eventually, I had maybe 30% of the actual finished idea that the story ended up being when I started writing, which is a little actually out of the ordinary for me. I am an outline writer. You know how Brandon Sanderson says there are outline writers and discovery writers. George R.R. Martin, I believe, calls them gardeners and architects. I'm very much an outline writer. I'm very much an architect. You know, I usually plan things out. And I did plan this story out, but I discovery wrote it more than I usually do. Which is often how I work for short stories, definitely much more so than for novels or novellas. I plot those extensively before I ever begin writing. But short stories, especially, you can just begin writing and then find things out about your story. The greater a percentage of the full idea you have when you begin, the better, in my opinion. But you can just find things out, even with a novel. When you begin writing, there are things that you will learn about the people in your book, about the setting. And I mean, you do technically come up with it, but I use the term learn because the way I like to think of it, the concept I like to use is essentially asking yourself, what do I know about this story? Because discovery writers or gardeners, so to speak, I'm sure will relate to this more strongly than outline writers or architects such as myself. But coming into a story, where, even with 1% of an idea, there are things you know about the story. There are things that you know about the characters. There's a story that I plan to write in the future. The only thing that I know about this story, for a fact, is that it is titled A Price I Haven't Paid. And from there, you will learn other things. Some things you can infer. For example, in my Parsec story, I inferred that one of the characters, like the one who said the first line, would be the more professional one, the one who cares more about his job, whereas the second one is more irreverent, a little bit wittier, a little bit less professional, more fast and loose with the rules. And that led to their difference in thinking when they came to a discovery that I also found out about in a way, which led to hinting at future conflict between them. There isn't actually much serious open conflict in the story, but they react in different ways to a discovery which begins a rift between them. I figured that all out, and I did come up with it, of course. I can't say I didn't come up with it, but it's almost more so that I learned it. So, the first thing you can ask yourself, once you have just 1% of an idea, is, what do I know about this story? What do I know about the characters? What do I know about the tone? Because the tone is going to set the rules, basically, for what you come up with for the rest of the story. Everything has to fit within that tone, unless you're Sondheim. Some people can pull off mixing it up with the tone, making a promise earlier and then breaking it. But especially as a newer writer, usually you're going to want to stick within the tone you start with. Especially when you're writing a short story where you don't have a lot of time to move from tone to tone to tone and progress the tone to a different state over the course of the story. I mean, you can. You can start happier and then progress it. But a good place to start if you don't have many ideas is to start with your tone and then write something that fits within that tone. That limits the total number of ideas you can use, so you're not picking from every single possible story idea in existence. Things are limited and easier to work with. You're only picking from the ideas that work within your tone. And then, so once you have your tone, then you know something about the characters. You can just start with a situation. Another technique, you just start with a situation that your characters are in, and then decide what are the characters going to do about this? What is each individual character's reaction to this situation, and why is this their reaction? Then you can look at them and make inferences. Okay, I know that this is how this particular character would react to this particular thing. What does this say about them? What is a person who would react like this to this thing like? What possible experiences or personality traits could lead to them reacting in this way? And then you understand what kind of a person this character is in, what kind of a person they are. Which then lets you know, okay, they reacted to this thing this way. Now that I know who they are, as this next thing happens, I know what they're going to do. That means that this thing must happen. And then usually what happens there for me is that I just realize more about I know the general direction that the character would point the plot in. And then, knowing how they would react to whichever things I put in their way, then I decide what to put in their way, which changes the plot, which moves them in a different direction, metaphorically, always, often literally, in a different physical direction, which means they might be going to a different part of the world, and now knowing what the characters are like, and where the plot is going, I think, wouldn't it mix well with those things if this particular part of the world was like this, which can then lead to your world building changing, and world building should always be based in some way on the characters and plot. Not completely, the world doesn't structure itself around the people living in it, the other way around, but the main focal point is always the characters and the plot, and the world building should serve that. So So then you think, what would the characters be like having grown up in a world like this? How does the culture that they grew up in affect who they ended up becoming? Or the specific people that they grew up around affect them in terms of how they grew into an adult? Uh, and how did they affect the people around them, which can bounce back and affect them? And essentially, you can bounce ideas off of each other to create more ideas, like particles in a reactor chamber. I don't know how particle reactions work, even though I'm doing pretty decently in my science class. But the world building affects the character, who affects the plot, which in turns around and can affect the character in terms of their arc, which doesn't neither of those can, unless they're a very, very important character, a very, very like wide scale important plot, directly affect the world building. But then, knowing new things about your plot and about your character, you can go back and change the world building, which changes character, which changes plot. So different parts of your story can interact and change each other. And of course, part of coming up with a good idea is knowing what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. And identifying a bad idea is a lot easier than telling a mediocre idea from a good idea. But most good ideas started as mediocre ideas. So we're not throwing those out immediately. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Very rarely will you have an idea that is a very good idea for a novel that started immediately in the author's head. The moment it popped in, it was a very good idea. It popped in as a interesting but very incomplete idea that became a bigger and bigger and bigger and better idea over time. So how do I identify a bad idea? Because if we start with a bad idea, no matter how big it gets, it's usually still going to be bad. You can make it better, but usually it's not going to end up being as good as it'd be if you started with a mediocre or good idea, obviously. So one of the first aspects of a bad idea is that the conflict is really easy to resolve. Unless you're writing a very short piece of fiction, this is mainly a bad idea for a novel or a novella. But I personally ran into this a lot. I came up with ideas for stories where the conflict driving the narrative could be wrapped up in a few chapters at most. And so to get it even to the length of a very short novella, I had to purposefully extend things. And while long stories work well, stories that are purposefully stretched because the author doesn't feel that they're long enough usually don't. So that's the first characteristic. The next characteristic is that it's not given to leading to any progression. You know, if somebody's missing and they're searching for them and somebody's hunting for them, that and there's like a time limit, that obviously you can think of that in your head. I can see how this is going to progress as time ticks down. The people who are hunting them get closer. They get more and more frustrated, not being able to find the person who's missing. This is all stuff from an idea for a story that I just recently came up with. May or may not be a novel that I write in the future. Who knows? But I've come up with many ideas in the past that do not have any obvious progression. Essentially, one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, what does this idea lead to the characters doing? Does it lead to them doing something that makes them collide with other characters, either bringing them together or having them butt heads in conflict, which is usually going to drive the majority of the plot in most stories? What will this lead to the characters doing? This is in part dependent on the characters, so to ask yourself this, you need to know at least a little bit about your characters. Although this can also help you decide what kind of character you want to create for your particular story. If your story just leads to your characters picking mushrooms, for their herbalist grandpa, and that's the whole story, and they just chat and they pick mushrooms. If that's the most expedient and logical way for the characters to solve the problem, you need a different problem. You need a problem that leads to high stakes encounters, that leads to not necessarily time ticking down in the sense like there's a time limit, we have to go, in the sense of the thriller. I mean, if you're writing a thriller, that's not a bad way to go, that there's a genuine time limit. Lots of stories use time limits to create progress and tension. But there doesn't necessarily need to be an actual literal time limit in your story, but there has to be some measurable way that going across the story, we can see that things are not as they were before. Things have obviously changed. The stakes have obviously gone up. The characters are not the same people they used to be. Something is different. So your idea should obviously have some way that it causes the characters to change themselves, change the world around them, change their relationship with other characters in a way that causes growth or conflict. And when I say obviously, I'm not saying it's obvious that it should have this. It should have this characteristic in order to be a good idea, and it should be obvious how it has this characteristic. You should be able to easily answer, how is this idea going to lead to some sort of progression throughout the story for the characters and or for the plot, preferably for both. If you can't easily answer that, it's probably not a good idea. And lastly, and this is by far not the last characteristic of what makes a bad idea, but this video has already gone on long enough, and I only know so many. So the last characteristic of a bad idea that I will leave you with is that it is reliant on the characters doing something that that person wouldn't do. If you have a character who just likes shooting people, and that's how he solves all of his problems, and he needs to let the villain go for the villain to go and do things to come back later for the plot to happen. If he needs to show mercy, but he's not a character who shows mercy, you need to either change your character or change your plot. Changing your plot is almost always the better choice, because changing your character will make things that happened earlier not make sense, probably things that happened later not make sense. You will probably end up having to change a lot more of the plot by changing your character than you will from just changing part of the plot. Maybe instead of the character letting the villain go, maybe the villain isn't powerful enough to beat him at first, although showing your villain getting beaten by the character early on will usually kill the stakes, so that's not recommended. But maybe the villain pulls some dastardly trick and escapes, and the character can't kill him, even though he would like to. But anytime a reader sees a scene in a book where the character does something that human being in real life, and of course it's not happening in real life, but if they were a real human being in real life, they would never do that, but they have to do it because the plot needs them to, that will always kick a reader out of your story. I know this is a fairly vague and incomplete guide to my idea coming up with process, but the process itself usually is fairly vague. It's hard to penetrate into your own psyche, much less the psyche of another, and figure out, where did this idea come from? Because your subconscious is, well, you're not conscious of it. And that's where at least most of your ideas come from. So it feels the idea just came out of nowhere. It popped from my subconscious somehow into my conscious, and then I stared at it and tinkered with it and thought about it, and then like a child it just grew and grew and grew, and that's how ideas become stories. So while this isn't a very concrete step-by-step solution, hopefully it can give you a basic framework that you can use to come up with ideas yourself. What works exactly for me will not work exactly for you. So the vagueness helps because you can apply this kind of thinking pattern to your own mind in a way that's basically your own interpretation of it. Hopefully, this method was helpful for you. If it was, leave a like, subscribe, comment if with the idea that this helped you come up with, if this helped you come up with any idea for a story. And don't forget that I would have put a catchphrase in here if I had a catchphrase. Comment below what catchphrase you think I should come up with, because now I kind of want to have one.